The honeymoon was supposed to be the beginning of a new life, a fairy tale that would unfold under the stars. But for Isabella, nothing seemed to be like in dreams. Married to Rashid, an Arab prince whose imposing presence and enigmatic charms had won her over at first sight, she found herself caught in a plot very different from the one she had imagined. She had always heard stories of princes who conquered hearts and kingdoms, but she had never imagined that love, in its purest form, could be so complex. Rashid was not just a prince. He was the future ruler of a vast empire with responsibilities and pressures that most people could not even comprehend. They had married in a grand ceremony, full of luxury and ancient traditions, and Isabella believed it would be the beginning of a life full of adventure and happiness. However, her expectations began to fade when they arrived at their private island for their honeymoon. Isabella, eager to spend peaceful days with her husband, discovered that the prince was increasingly distant, physically and emotionally. On the first day, he seemed absorbed in last-minute commitments, which were an excuse to spend more time alone. On the second, he immersed himself in his worries about the kingdom, leaving her alone in a dreamscape. As the days passed, the reality became more painful. He not only ignored her presence, but also her anxiety, her desire for connection, and her feelings. On that isolated island with crystal-clear waters, reflecting the warm sun and palm trees swaying in the gentle breeze, Isabella found herself a spectator in her own story, unable to reach the prince, who seemed to be in a distant world, oblivious to her needs. What seemed like a fairy tale was slowly turning into a silent nightmare, where the prince showed himself not as the expected hero, but rather as someone who ignored her. Between the lonely nights and endless days of waiting, a question began to arise. Was she a beloved wife or a mere pawn in a power game? And more importantly, would she have the courage to face the truth? Or would their love story be marked by silence and loneliness? Isabella, a young middle-class American woman, never imagined her life would take such an unexpected turn. She grew up in a small coastal town, where dreams of traveling far away were kept alive by stories from friends and fashion magazines. Nothing prepared her for the idea of marrying an Arab prince. When Rashid appeared in her life, he was not only the prince of a distant land, but also a man with an aura of royalty that seemed otherworldly. But more than that, he had something that captivated her in a unique way, a sensitivity behind his dark eyes and a profound silence that said more than any words. She had been seduced by the idea of adventure, of living a love story that would sound like a fairy tale. And he, with his charm, friendliness, and mysterious aura of power, seemed the perfect man for it. Marrying Rashid was not only an act of love, but also a promise of a life of opulence and opportunity. The immense mansion he owned in her country's capital, the extravagant dinners, the luxury cars, the constant presence of advisors and security, it all seemed like part of a dream come true. But as she got to know Rashid better, shadows began to loom. He was not only a prince, he was also a ruler in the making, with obligations that went far beyond a quiet life with a wife. His father, the current monarch, was an austere and distant figure who imposed heavy expectations on his son. Rashid was being groomed to rule, and this required sacrifice. Though he was affectionate at times, tension was always in the air. His mind was constantly far away, occupied with political duties and internal matters of the kingdom that Isabella barely understood. On their honeymoon, Rashid tried to keep up appearances, but it quickly became clear to Isabella that she was no longer a priority. The distance between them grew with each passing day. Over the course of their solitary candlelit dinners, she began to wonder if this disconnect was simply a reflection of his responsibilities, or if there was something deeper going on, something she didn't yet understand. The contrast between their two worlds was clear. While Isabella wanted a marriage based on companionship, laughter, and moments of togetherness, Rashid seemed lost in politics and family matters. His family's history was marked by a constant struggle for power and the preservation of the empire. Rashid, despite being a young man, already carried a heavy responsibility on his shoulders. He could not be both the caring prince Isabella envisioned and the firm ruler the empire needed. The clash between Isabella's expectations and the reality of Rashid's life was becoming unbearable. But there was something else she didn't know. Rashid, though seemingly oblivious to his wife's pain, was struggling with his own demons. He wasn't the villain of the story, but rather someone tormented by the weight of his responsibilities, trying to balance his desire to please his wife with his obligations as a future monarch. The days on the island dragged on, and the distance between Isabella and Rashid became increasingly unbearable. She could no longer hide the frustration growing within her. With every empty smile from Rashid, every excuse he gave for his absence, a deep doubt gripped her heart. The prince was pulling away, and she didn't know why. Was it the pressure of the kingdom, or was there something else he was hiding from her? Meanwhile, the prince seemed increasingly immersed in the tasks of governance that plagued him, even during their honeymoon. He spent long hours in his office with his advisors and ministers, discussing matters Isabella couldn't even understand. He spoke of trade agreements with neighboring countries, peace treaties, and even negotiations with leaders of internal factions. It was a world far removed from the one she imagined sharing with him. One afternoon, after another lonely day, Isabella decided to confront him. She was tired of hiding behind forced smiles and empty excuses. She approached Rashid as he was reviewing some papers, his attention completely focused on his work. "Rashid," she said, trying to remain calm, but anger was in her voice. "We need to talk." He looked up, noticing the seriousness on her face. Something in her gaze made his heart sink. She had never looked like this before, determined, yet visibly hurt. "I know you're busy, but this has gone on too far. I feel alone, ignored. You've been leaving me out all the time, and I don't know what to think anymore." Rashid sighed, closing his eyes for a moment. "I didn't want it to be like this. I'm trying my best, Isabella. You don't understand the pressure I'm under." "I don't understand," Isabella replied, feeling the words come out more bitter than she intended. "I'm your wife, Rashid. I'm not an accessory, not someone you push aside when you're tired or too busy. I deserve more than that. I deserve for you to look me in the eye and treat me like a partner, not a shadow." He stood, walking toward her. There was something different in his gaze, a pain she didn't recognize. "I know what you need, and I'm trying to be the man you desire. But you don't understand, Isabella, that what's at stake is much bigger than the two of us. I'm a prince, and my destiny has already been sealed. I can't run from my responsibilities, not even for you. I can't be the husband you expect, and at the same time, the leader my people demand." Isabella took a step back, pain piercing her chest. Rashid's words were like a blow. She knew he had a huge weight on his shoulders, but that didn't explain the emptiness between them. She felt as if she were talking to a man she no longer knew, as if he were merely a shadow of himself. She looked at him, the prince with his eyes deeply marked by internal struggle, and felt a deep sadness. She didn't know if she could go on like this. She didn't know if she could be his wife, or if he wanted her to be. "So, what does this mean for us?" she asked, her voice shaking. Rashid hesitated. "I don't know. I just know that right now I can't be the man you expect. I don't know if I'm capable of that." Those words fell like a death sentence on what Isabella believed to be her future. At first, she couldn't process it. All she wanted was some attention, some genuine love, but it seemed none of that was part of what Rashid was willing to give. And in that moment, reality became clear. He was pulling away from her. and maybe it was too late to reverse it. As the conflict between Isabella and Rashid took over their lives, other tensions began to simmer in the shadows, ready to explode at any moment. The island they were on was a place of serene beauty, but also of unsolved secrets and mysteries, which slowly began to intertwine with their reality. One of these secrets involved Rashid's relationship with his family. Despite the facade of perfection, the bonds between him and his father, the king, were strained and fraught with unrealizable expectations. The king had always held a rigid view of royalty, and from the moment Rashid had become engaged to Isabella, the weight of being heir to the crown seemed to have become even more unbearable. The prince found himself forced to submit to political alliances and family demands, all in the name of the empire, while his personal life dissolved before his eyes. Isabella, for her part, began to realize that what she imagined to be a simple emotional distance from Rashid was actually related to much deeper issues. She discovered through conversations with servants on the island that Rashid had been receiving daily pressure from his father to make decisions about the future of the kingdom. Decisions that involved not only the empire, but also Rashid's own marriage. Rumors suggested that his union with Isabella was more a political strategy than genuine love. The pain Isabella felt at being left out began to mix with the anger of the discovery. She felt like a piece on a chessboard, moved without any regard for her own wishes or feelings. The image of Prince Charming was disintegrating with each passing day, and the frustration she harbored at not being able to connect with him was transforming into something more dangerous: distrust. At the same time, the presence of Karim, one of Rashid's closest advisors, was beginning to create even greater tension. Karim was a charming and attentive man, but his attention to Isabella seemed to go beyond the simple courtesy of a family friend. When she passed him on the island, their glances exchanged something neither Isabella nor he were willing to admit. Sometimes he would find her alone, in moments of distress, and offer words of comfort, with an empathy that Rashid seemed incapable of demonstrating. These small gestures from Karim began to confuse Isabella. She didn't want to believe there could be anything between her and the counselor, but loneliness and the need for attention were beginning to affect her perception of everything. Karim seemed like a family man, respectful and dedicated, and this made her wonder if she was being unfair to him. However, there was a fine line between friendship and something more, and she knew that crossing it could be ruin for everyone, including herself. Meanwhile, Rashid, in his isolation, was struggling internally. He knew he couldn't be the man Isabella wanted, but he also felt trapped by a destiny he couldn't control. His love for her was genuine, but his responsibilities consumed him to such an extent that he no longer knew how to balance the two. He feared losing Isabella, but at the same time, he felt he could not deny the demands of the empire and his family. The pressure was becoming unbearable, and he began making decisions that took him further away from everything he valued. Isabella, for her part, began to question whether she could continue living in this limbo, where love became a daily chore, and her husband seemed like a distant stranger. She felt left behind as Rashid sank deeper and deeper into his responsibilities. The subplots of emotional betrayal and loneliness began to intertwine, and she found herself at a crossroads. Should she stay married and try to understand Rashid's motivations, or should she seek something outside this world, where perhaps happiness could be found without the constraints of duty? Tensions on the island were reaching a fever pitch. Isabella could no longer bear Rashid's emotional distance. The emptiness within her chest grew, and she knew she needed a definitive answer. She could no longer be the wife of a man who ignored her, who saw her only as a political obligation, not as a life partner. In a moment of desperation, Isabella made a decision that would change everything. She would leave the island and return to the United States. The night she decided to leave the island, heartbroken, she went to Rashid's office. She found him in his usual miniature kingly posture, surrounded by papers and notes, immersed in a political crisis he clearly couldn't resolve. He looked up when he saw her, but his expression was so distant, as if she were an intruder in his world of obligations. "Rashid, I can't take it anymore," she began, her voice trembling. "I'm not your shadow. I can't stay in a place where I'm not seen, where I'm not loved. I'm leaving." Rashid, as always, looked at her with that weary look, but something was different about that moment. He seemed to finally realize the gravity of the situation, but his words were still choked, as if he were fighting something much bigger than himself. "Isabella, please," he said, his voice low, as if she were a lost child. I don't know what more you want from me. I'm not the man you think I am. I'm what my father made me, what my destiny made me, and I can't change that." Those words cut like a knife. Isabella took a step back, feeling the weight of it all. But in that instant, the revelation came, and everything changed. A letter Rashid had left on the table, bearing a royal seal, fell to the floor. She bent down to pick it up, and upon opening it she read the contents, something she had never imagined. The letter was a message from his father, the king, clearly written to inform him that his marriage to Isabella was not a personal choice, but a strategic alliance. He had been instructed to keep up appearances, but his heart was never truly hers. The king demanded that he remain distant and focused on the interests of the empire, and that any personal feelings should be set aside. The shock was instantaneous. Isabella read and reread the words, each line harder to digest than the last. What she had assumed was a lost romance between two worlds was, in fact, a political construct. She was not loved, not even truly desired. She was a pawn in a power game, and nothing more. What had seemed like a simple disconnect was now revealed as a betrayal, not of Rashid, but of the very structure he was trapped in. She looked at him, her eyes filled with disbelief. "So this was all a lie? The love you said you felt for me? It was all a sham?" Rashid finally stood, his eyes dark and filled with regret. "I didn't want it to be this way. I fell in love with you, but I never had control over my life. I was chosen to be a ruler, Isabella, not a husband." Isabella felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. The pain of abandonment was now something much deeper, a bitter revelation that she had never truly held a place in Rashid's heart. But something inside her also stirred. She knew she needed to take control of her own life, no longer caring what Rashid's fate would impose upon her. "Then it's decided," she said with renewed strength. "I'm no longer part of this game. I'm going to live for myself." With those words, she turned, leaving the office and heading for the boat that would take her back to the mainland. The sun was beginning to set, illuminating the ocean with golden hues, but to Isabella the horizon had never looked so clear. She was free to follow her own path, away from the lies and manipulation of a prince who had never truly known what love was. Isabella left the island without looking back, but her heart was heavy. Upon arriving back in the United States, she felt a mixture of relief and sadness. Relief at finally taking control of her life, but also sadness at the way things had ended. She had been the victim of a lie, a pawn in a political game, and now she was alone, but with the opportunity to rebuild herself. In her hometown, life seemed to have returned to normal, but she couldn't shake the feeling of loss. Though the island was now a distant memory, the emptiness she felt from the lack of genuine love was still there. Isabella knew she would need time to heal, to forget the distant prince, and accept that perhaps he had never been able to truly love her. However, Rashid was living a nightmare of his own. When he learned of Isabella's departure, he felt the weight of his actions as never before. At first, he tried to maintain his princely pride and deny the void her absence created in his life. But as the days passed, he began to realize how much she meant to him. The pain of her loss was intense, much more than he had imagined. The emptiness he felt now was the consequence of his own choices. What he thought was a political obligation was actually a love unlived, a lost opportunity. He sank into an endless routine of royal duties, but Isabella's image wouldn't leave his mind. The lonely nights, the empty conversations with ministers and advisors, nothing fulfilled him anymore. He tried desperately to return to his position as prince, but the responsibility of ruling felt increasingly like a burden, especially when he thought of all that could have been with her. He never had the chance to show her how he truly felt, and now it seemed too late. Isabella, on the other hand, began to get involved in projects that made her feel like she had something important to contribute. She returned to school and worked on social causes, and over time her wounds began to heal. She dedicated herself to helping those who, like her, needed a chance to start over. With each step, she felt stronger, more confident, and less dependent on the shadow of a man who, in her life, could never be what she expected. She learned to value herself, to find happiness within herself, without needing validation from Rashid or anyone else. Meanwhile, Prince Rashid continued his lonely journey, unsure how to make amends for the mistake he had made. He found himself at a crossroads, a man who had the world at his fingertips, but who, deep down, knew he had lost what truly mattered. In his mind, the image of Isabella remained intact, the woman he had ignored and who was now beyond his reach. Perhaps, deep down, he knew there was no going back. Their story didn't have a happy ending. They went their separate ways, but both were transformed by the experience. Rashid learned the hard way that true love can't be forced, and that sometimes wrong choices cost more than any title or power. Isabella, for her part, learned the lesson that before seeking happiness with someone else, you must find it within yourself. Isabella, months after leaving Rashid behind, felt like she was finally starting to breathe again. Her life in the United States returned to its normal rhythm, but nothing was the same. The woman who left the island full of insecurities and doubts was now stronger, more resolute. The emptiness she had felt due to the prince's absence began to fill with new purpose, with the confidence she had built herself without relying on anyone to validate her. She dedicated herself to her studies and volunteer work, especially with women who, like her, had experienced abusive or disillusioned relationships. Her own past now served as a platform to help other women find their feet. Isabella became an advocate for female autonomy, firmly believing that true happiness could only be achieved when one was in tune with oneself. Little by little, she built a new life. And over time, she realized that the pain of Rashid's departure didn't completely disappear, but rather transformed into something more productive. She used the experience to strengthen herself, and with each project, each new step, she felt more connected to her true self. Her world was now made of her own choices, of a freedom she never knew existed. She traveled to diverse places, immersing herself in different cultures, seeking not just an escape valve, but a deeper understanding of the world around her. She became a respected woman in her field, an influential voice in her community. The loneliness that once terrified her now became an opportunity to learn more and rediscover herself. Isabella learned to cope with the pain of losing someone she initially thought was everything. She understood that love didn't have to be perfect, but rather sincere. And although Rashid was never able to offer her the genuine love she desired, she knew, in the end, that the most important love was the one she cultivated within herself. The woman who left the island was now a grown woman, shaped by her experiences, the choices she made, and above all, by the courage to be who she truly was. That chapter of her life no longer defined her, but transformed her. And looking back, she no longer felt sadness, but gratitude, for having found strength she never knew she possessed. Months have passed since Isabella left the island and returned to her life in the United States. She reinvented herself, becoming a stronger woman and more focused on her independence. But while she achieved new personal and professional victories, a presence from the past wouldn't leave her alone: Rashid. Although he had never communicated directly with her since his departure, Isabella knew he was trying his best to move on with his life and fulfill his father's expectations. But there was something in his demeanor, an aura of sadness he couldn't hide, that haunted her. She knew he was struggling to maintain his identity separate from the obligations of the kingdom, and with each news about the prince that reached her ears, something inside her stirred. The doubt about what could have been between them, the feeling that he still carried a silent pain, began to bother her again. But, contrary to what she thought, destiny was preparing a final clash between them. One morning, Isabella received a letter from a mutual friend she had met during her previous life on the island. It was a letter from Rashid, sent through his advisor. The letter was filled with words of regret, and Rashid begged her to meet him again. He was no longer willing to live trapped in an arranged marriage and wanted, above all, to clarify his intentions. He admitted he had made a mistake in letting her leave without a fight, and that despite all his responsibilities as a prince, he felt there was still a chance for them. Isabella was paralyzed. The letter not only stirred her emotions, but also put her at a crossroads. She knew that by accepting a meeting with Rashid, she would be reliving her entire past, her insecurities, and even the memories of what they had lost. She also knew it could affect her newly acquired identity. Her heart raced at the prospect of a fresh start, but she also felt the weight of uncertainty. What did he really want? Was he seeking their happiness, or just trying to alleviate his own guilt? After a day of reflection, Isabella decided to go to him, not because she felt the need to return to the prince, but because she wanted the answer that would finally give her inner peace. She prepared for the trip, but something inside her already knew. Whatever happened between them, she would never be the same. This visit would be the closing of a cycle, the final chapter of a story that somehow was still incomplete. She packed her bags with a sense of courage she hadn't felt before and set sail for the place where it all began. Her soul was at peace, but her heart, still vulnerable, was ready to finally understand what Rashid had to offer, or what she could offer herself as she faced the last shadows of her past. Isabella arrived at her destination with her heart racing. She was on the same island as before, but now she was a transformed woman. She was no longer the young woman who had fallen in love with a distant prince full of empty hopes. She was a strong woman, with her own identity, with a new purpose. The warm sea breeze seemed to welcome her, but also to bring back all the ghosts of her past. Each step brought her closer to Rashid's house. Each step brought her closer to the ultimate revelation. When she finally arrived, he was waiting for her on the porch, in the soft afternoon light. Rashid looked different, but still had the same princely aura, imposing, yet marked by the weight of the choices he had made. His eyes, however, were empty of any pride. It was the look of a man who had lost something irretrievable. They stared at each other in silence for a long moment, the tension in the air almost palpable. The sound of the waves crashing against the shore seemed to be the only sound filling the emptiness between them. "Isabella," Rashid began, his voice hoarse, filled with regret. "I was wrong. I lost you, and now I see that you're the only thing I ever really wanted." She looked at him, unsure how to respond. The pain and anger were still there, but something inside her told her it was time to end this chapter, whatever that ending might be. "You lost me, Rashid, because you couldn't see me. You couldn't see who I am and what I need. I'm not a pawn in a power game. I didn't want to be loved for convenience, but for who I am." Rashid leaned closer, his eyes begging for a chance to make amends. "I know that now, and believe me, I'd do anything to turn back time. I didn't know how to be the man you wanted, but I'm willing to learn, to change." Isabella, however, felt a different kind of pain now. It was no longer pain from his absence, but from the realization that, despite the sincerity in his words, Rashid was still trapped in a world where decisions weren't his to make. He was still the prince, the heir to the empire, and this still made him incapable of giving her the freedom she desired. She took a deep breath, feeling an inner strength she never imagined she had. "Rashid, I truly loved you, but I can no longer live in a world where love is something you have to do. What you offer me now is no longer what I need. I need more than promises. I need a life where I can be myself, where love is a choice, not an imposition." He looked at her with desperation in his eyes, as if he were ready to give in, to change, but she already knew it wasn't enough. She no longer wanted to wait for changes that might never come. She was no longer the woman who accepted crumbs of love. She was the woman who had learned to love and respect herself. Isabella took a step back, looking at him one last time. "Goodbye, Rashid. I was never the woman you wanted, and now you're not the man I need. It's time for each of us to go our separate ways." She turned, walking toward the boat that would take her back. The sound of the waves was the only thing that filled the next few minutes. Rashid, standing there, watching her leave, finally understood the magnitude of what he had lost. Isabella didn't look back. She knew that despite all the pain, this was the choice she had to make. She was free. Isabella, upon returning to the United States, found a life completely different from the one she had before meeting Rashid. The love and pain she experienced on the island were behind her, but not without leaving scars. She no longer regretted it, but she knew her choices had shaped her profoundly. She finally accepted that there was no going back. The woman who left the island no longer existed. She had rebuilt herself and, more importantly, found herself again. Her volunteer work with women who had been through similar situations made her feel fulfilled, as if what she was experiencing now was more meaningful than any relationship she had lost. She helped others find strength within themselves, just as she had done. Rashid, for his part, continued to rule his kingdom. But something in him had changed. He was no longer the prince who hid behind duties and expectations. Isabella's absence, the pain of her loss, made him reconsider his own role in life and relationships. He knew that true love could not be forced, and that he had lost the only woman who truly understood him. The lesson, though painful, was crucial to his evolution as a man and a leader. Isabella became a respected woman, no longer defined by what others expected of her, but by her own journey. She found the peace she so desperately sought, not through the love of a prince, but through self-love. And over time, she learned that no matter how much the winds of life may change, the ability to reinvent oneself and choose one's own destiny is what truly matters. She looked to the future with a smile on her face, knowing that no matter what happened, she could walk on her own. Her past of lost loves, illusions, and disappointments was behind her like a closed book, but the woman he'd created was now stronger than she'd ever imagined. Years have passed since that encounter on the island, but the lessons Isabella learned have never left her. She traveled the world, saw new places, new cultures, and most importantly, discovered herself in ways she never imagined. The legacy of her transformation was something she shared with all the women she crossed paths with, all the souls she helped rescue from the darkness of doubt and insecurity. Though she never returned to the island, never saw Rashid again, a part of her had known somehow that he too was continuing his journey, alone but bearing the weight of all the choices he had made. He, like her, was constantly transforming, but their lives would never cross again. The love that had once existed between them was now but a distant memory, a lesson in what cannot be forced. Isabella, in her new life, felt peace. Each day she moved closer to the future she had always dreamed of for herself. No strings attached, no limitations, just the horizon ahead. And although love was still a mystery, she knew that the greatest form of love was the freedom to be who one is, to be the master of one's own destiny. But one quiet afternoon, while walking along the beach, Isabella found a letter. Her old letter from Rashid, forgotten, unexplained, carried by the wind. She smiled to herself, not angry, just with a slight sense of longing. It was a reminder of a chapter that had been closed, but that would always have its place in the story of her life. She let the letter drift away with a sigh. The future was hers, and nothing held her back anymore. If you were moved by Isabella and Rashid's story, share your thoughts in the comments below. What part touched your heart the most? Do you believe that true love always finds a way, or that sometimes you have to move on to discover true happiness? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more exciting stories like this. Your opinion is very important to us, and we want to hear what you think. What